Welcome back to the channel. My name is Cairo. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. Today I wanted to talk about something that's been going on in the NBA over the last few years, and something that I've noticed is that players with these type of archetypes usually don't really get paid, and they genuinely aren't as valued compared to a lot of different other players and how they play. And it's, in my opinion, the least favorable archetype, and it's that sh- to put it nicely, that shot chucking, doesn't really pass the ball a lot. Pretty difficult shot maker in terms of not getting the best shot availability and shot separation. The microwave scorer. And, recently I made a TikTok about somebody like Cam Thomas who is valued very lowly in terms of his skill set, right? Somebody who is, in my opinion, is getting a little bit lowballed with 14 million a year, and as the NBA salary and the salary cap overall begins to increase, I do think players who aren't as valued now will be getting paid a lot more. And I just personally, I'm on both sides of the fences in terms of how I view these types of players. I do think teams would generally look the other way if they don't really like these types of players, right? These types of skill sets, like, and it's not just Cam Thomas, but like some other guys I have listed off are the Bones Highland, especially Jalen Green, the Kevin Porter Juniors, maybe the Cam Whitmores of the world, those type of guys. And even in this draft, you could argue Trey Johnson, right? These type of archetypes aren't really favorable, and these players tend to not really get paid or treated as well unless you're drafted pretty highly most of the time, right? Obviously, you'll have some anomalies here and there. But I always thought it was interesting because Cam Thomas, there was been a lot of debate and like beef with him, with like him and Zach Lowe, I'm pretty sure, on Twitter, and how even though he is on the Nets, he is still a player that is putting up very good numbers while being double teamed, and he has shown that he can pass the ball pretty well. And of course, playing with the Nets, you have to take it with a grain of salt because it's not really the best form of competition in who's he's passing the ball to, how he's getting his types of shots. Most of his teammates can't really create their own shot, right? But the TikTok that I made, I just thought it was just lowballing it in terms of who he is as a player. I think him being able to score, being double teamed, one of the most double teamed players in the league, is absolutely insane. You could argue, the efficiency here and there, and how, you know, his usage is pretty high, right? You could argue, I think somebody like Donovan Mitchell has exited those conversations, and that's the type of video that I wanted to make today, just looking over these types of archetypes and why it's the least favorable. But I do think there is a threshold with like how we value certain types of players. Because in my opinion, I think Donovan Mitchell used to be in this type of mode, but he's slowly shown that he is the best player on the Cavaliers, and how he's exited that conversation, how he's elevated, right? So to get started, I think, you know, I would categorize it in three different categories, right? So don't really have a name for it, but guys who have exited that conversation of being that microwave chuck, you know, guys who chuck shots up. Sorry, my English. Oh my god. But and then you have guys that are on the lower end that weren't drafted really highly, but maybe have gone some stints here and there and have proven themselves a little bit. And then guys in that middle tier who have, gotten paid here and there, but teams don't really value them, and they kind of just subpar and, flatline towards the end of their career. And some guys I have in that first section, that column, I would say a Bones Highland type of player, potentially an Armani Bates. Other guys, let's see. Those are the two main guys that I have that are in that lower echelon tier. Kevin Porter Jr. as well. Guys that have proven themselves here and there, but because they were drafted pretty lowly and whatever they did in college wasn't really valued in the league. These types of archetypes where, like I said, they're taking extremely difficult shots. They don't really pass the ball. I remember, I wouldn't classify Cam Whitmore in this tier. He's more of a threshold between, because he's still a pretty highly drafted pick at the 20th pick, right? But I think, you know, him being a bigger body and him, not having the best situation in Houston does really affect him a lot, because Ime Udoka did say that he wanted to give him the best chance to develop. And I think, I'm pretty sure I saw an interview where he was asking why he doesn't get any more minutes. Why, what can he do to get more minutes? And I thought it was a great conversation to have because when you look at the eye test, the stats, he wasn't really passing the ball. He was taking a lot of difficult shots. And if you're a GM looking at this from a GM's perspective, you're probably thinking, if we drafted this guy in the lottery, it's a different story. But because we drafted him outside of the lottery in the mid first round or maybe in the second round, we're not fully invested into these types of players. So a guy, if we're trying to develop young players, if we're trying to really push the young players to their best ability, you really have to play a role in the NBA, which is another argument as to why maybe Cam Thomas isn't valued in the league because he's playing on the Nets. He was drafted in the mid 20s, not coming out of the best basketball program. And, it's same with a guy like Cam Whitmore, Bones Highland, Kevin Porter Jr., and Amani Bates. Like, there's been so many narratives, especially when it comes to if they're good in high school. A lot of people have this weird intuition and narrative that these guys should be getting minutes. Oh my god, these guys should be playing. They should be the main guys. But like, it's really playing a role. And Draymond Green said it best. Like, there's really one or two players on the team that can do whatever they want, and everybody else has to play a role. We saw what OKC and the Pacers did in the finals, and how well all their guys played a role. They don't have a guy that really just shot chucks. Just does everything for himself, right? I think Shea I wouldn't say he was in the conversation, but you could argue that he is not really in that type of mode because he can do other things on the court. And that's one thing I forgot to mention. These guys don't really do anything else on the court besides score. And that's a difficult metric to measure, So I would say those guys who are drafted pretty lowly, the Kevin Porter Jr.'s, the Imani Bates, and the maybe Jordan Clarksons, they aren't really valued as high, so they aren't really paid as much. And there's a big reason for that, right? So these guys don't provide much besides scoring. And then if we move into that middle tier, in my middle tier, I have guys like Jalen Green, Bradley Beal, or formerly Bradley Beal, and then Zach LaVine, guys like those who are in that weird threshold where they're essentially, if I'm looking at it, Jalen Green is getting $35 million annually, Zach LaVine $43 million. If you want to say Cam Whitmore about $15 million for 4 years, and then Bradley Beal just signed a 2-year, $11 million deal. These are guys that are clearly valued in the league, but they only provide one thing in scoring. So I just think this archetype doesn't help you win. Right, and I think that's the big grand scheme of things where we're moving into an era, or maybe we've been in this era for a while, where teams scoring really isn't the thing. I watched the video with, I forgot the trainer, I really forgot the trainer, but he was training with Matt Barnes and telling Matt Barnes, hey, I've played in the league for over 10 years just by playing great defense and playing a role. Jeff Teague said it himself as well, just playing a role. And sometimes these guys, when you have that weird trajectory in high school where you're that number one guy, and then you come into the NBA, and if you're not a lottery pick, you not being invested in as much is really going to hurt yourself because you only really know how to do is score. And that's an issue, right? So that's why we see Jalen Green really struggle in terms of, he was a third overall draft pick, I'm pretty sure, or second. I can't remember. But either way, he was supposed to be that number one guy, and in the playoffs he stunk it up. He had like 130-point game, and then everything else he was just extremely inefficient, took the worst shots possible. He just wasn't there, right? And these types of microwave scorers, like I said, they don't lead you to wins. If they can't do anything else on the court, they're not going to help you, right? And I think Bradley Beal is now, because he's not getting a big contract, and if he's coming off the bench, I would say being a six man is a role in itself, right? I think Bradley Beal is very underrated, and then he would probably be entering in a different category by himself, just being, a guy who can score off the bench, right? Another guy in this threshold, I forgot. I think he's a big one, RJ Barrett. I think RJ Barrett, and usually these guys in these scoring like modes, these microwave scores, really. Usually they tend to be shooting guards, but we have other guys, like I said, like I mentioned Cam Whitmore, but I think RJ Barrett's a big one too. He puts up very good numbers, but he struggles, I'm pretty sure, to finish at the rim, and he's also pretty bad defender. But he puts up great numbers. He can score the ball, He doesn't take the best shots available, but there's a reason why you see on Twitter where people are comparing him, usually before the NBA Finals, a lot to a Jalen Williams. And I find that one interesting because obviously Jalen Williams is younger, but he's also an extremely good defender, one of the best defenders in the league, and he provides something else better than scoring. He could also play make, which RJ Barrett isn't the best at, right? So these archetypes are slowly dying. They're getting passed around. Zach LaVine's another big one in this threshold, in that middle tier, where they don't provide defense. He's changed himself. He's Zach LaVine has entered that 3-point specialist type of mode, and I like that for him. But it's really a different game now. Role players matter a lot, and I said it in my last video. Everybody talks about how the NBA is so much better now, and it's really because those 3 to 15 guys are so much better, right? You need to have role players in your team, and that's so much more favorable in your hands in terms of these types of archetypes. But now I wanted to get into that last threshold. These guys that potentially used to be in this tier, but they're exiting out. And to be honest, and these are usually the all-star caliber players, like true all-stars, in their prime currently. And the main one that I have is just Donovan Mitchell. I think he has shown the ability to play make and play with bigs, play with Evan Mobley. He is on a really good team. But I think one thing that I disliked about Donovan, especially coming from Utah, is that the inefficiency in the playoffs, the inefficiency, the shot chucking, it was really like there. Like you could definitely tell there were times where he was just throwing it up, and it would really dismantle the teams at time, and he took a lot of shots away. And there was a stat as well of him not like passing to Gobert at all, like barely passing him, maybe like an assist a game to Gobert, especially even when he had like a smaller guy on him, he just wouldn't pass him the ball. So for a while, I thought that was very detrimental to him. But as he's gone to Cleveland, he's shown an ability to really just score on an entire different. He's really separated himself from the other threshold, right? So I think things he does differently, like I said, is the playmaking. He's not an amazing defender, but I would say he's definitely a lot better defender than the people in the second tier that I have. But I think it's him. He showed a great ability to score and be that number one guy on the best conference in the NBA, or not conference, but the highest seed. Like I don't think Zach LaVine is going to be your best player on the number one seed, or Jalen Green, or Cam, or these types of guys, right? But yeah, another player that is controversial that could be in either one of these tiers is Tyler Hero. I think that's kind of a crazy take in my opinion, but he has shown an ability to be an all-star type of player. And it comes to a certain point where these archetypes where you get so good to the point where you shot chucking doesn't even really matter. And if you can't really play any defense, it's not really there, right? If Luka wasn't an elite playmaker, but he could still score, he would be in that final tier, that upper echelon tier, right? So yeah, it just gets to a certain point. But Tyler Hero is just a difficult one because he has shown an ability to play on an all-star level, but he doesn't really provide defense. And they try to make him be a point guard, but it's not really there. So yeah, these guys, I just wanted to, see, I'm looking at these guys' contract, and at the end of the day, I was interesting to do research about this and talk about it because I looked at Cam Thomas and his contract, and I made a TikTok video about it and how like 14 million in my opinion is very low ball in Cam Thomas. I'm sorry, he is in that second threshold for me, but even if he's on the Nets, the way that I like to look about it, especially with Cam Thomas, is if he is a third option or even a fourth option, and he's getting paid around, now they were saying 14 million. I'm not saying 25 plus. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I wouldn't be mad if he got paid between 18 to 22, 23 million. I think for a third option player, as the salary cap is increasing, to get that type of value, and if he's only averaging 15 to 17 points per game, I think it's pretty good. Now, you could argue, efficiency, him not being able to play great defense, but he has shown a great way to play make. He has shown that capability. I think it's something to consider. These guys, even though they aren't the most favorable and teams don't value these players because they don't really lead to winning, you need the role players. I think at the end of the day, there is a chance you can take on certain types of players where their scoring doesn't hinder everything else they do on the court. And I think that's something very important to consider. So yeah, those are my top, those are my 3 thresholds of players where, guys in the lower end, the the Amani Bates, the guys who were drafted very lowly, in like the second round, but they have shown an ability to score here and there, but they don't really get invested in. And then you have the middle threshold of guys like the R.J. Barretts, the Cam Whitmores, the Jalen Greens, guys who can, score, and they provide other things on the court. But I think because they were drafted a little bit higher, teams put a little bit more of an investment in those types of players. But generally, they don't really lead to much wins. And then you get guys that really succumb and just go past that narrative. And it's really, there's probably other guys in the league that I'm missing, but the main guy I'm thinking about is the Donovan Mitchell. Him being the best player on the number one seed is a great way to say that he is that guy. But yeah, I thought this was just an interesting video to talk about. These players are getting passed around a lot. I think Malik Monk, you could also argue, is in these types of conversations as well. But yeah, teams, if you're a GM, you don't really like these types of players. So yeah, it's something that was great and I wanted to talk about. And thank you so much for watching. And if you disagree, let me know. And if you have any other guys in mind, let me know. Comment down below. But if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Thank you so much. My name is Cairo.